A bit, yeah, okay. It's, I mean, my focus is pretty much on The Guardian. I'd just like to say, actually, I think it's excellent that we have simultaneous translation for the hearing impaired, which is something you so rarely see at conferences, but which I think is really great from the inclusivity point of view. So yes, the topic is big data and journalism, although I wonder sometimes whether it's more sort of versus journalism, because often for journalists there's a sort of feeling that they shouldn't be told what to do, that actually they can do things by instinct, and that they'll be much better if they do it that way. Although one does see that there are other ways of thinking about this. And that the fact you can measure what people do on the web, that so much reading is done on the web now, far more than is done on actual printed paper, does mean that people have different thoughts about how to use it. So one of the examples, and this was something which came up earlier this week from a guy called Dan Barker, he said he'd been examining what Buzzfeed does and the things that Buzzfeed actually collects about you. When you go to a Buzzfeed page, he was very interested by a Buzzfeed quiz. And he found that the things that are being collected in this quiz seemed to him to be a bit more than you might expect, because he was looking at all the parameters, all the variables, all the things that are being collected about you. There's the usual stuff, as he said, everything they collect. But then he said, but this is going a bit far. He first was just looking at the code behind it, behind the page, and he said there are 49 variables plus 5 other things at the top. So you have all the list of custom variables all down there, and towards the top you have the campaign, stuff like that. And he said, that's a lot of things to be collecting about people. Can you really measure people sort of 49 dimensionally? Are there 49 dimensions to people that are useful to you, informative to you, for them as readers? And he then said, also, look at what it is that they're asking you. They know what you click on this quiz. They know what these things are about you. And because they have a way of identifying you through all these variables they collected about you, all the things that you've clicked, are they actually doing something which goes beyond just being a website? Are they sort of starting to cross the creepy line? The quiz that the people are being asked to do was check your privilege. You know, are you a white male living in the suburbs who sort of has a nice, comfortable job, compared to someone who might be living in an Indian slum, though possibly not many Indian slum dwellers were actually able to get to the page. But you sort of get the principle. So he wrote this, very interesting blog post, which got a lot of reaction, including reaction from Buzzfeed itself. And they said, we don't record the fact that it's, quote, you. We don't know who you is. All we know is that there's this collection of information. The string sent to GA, Google Analytics, that is not your username, but an anonymized string. It's not linked in any way to your account email address, We're only interested in data in the aggregate form. For a journalist coming across this, and obviously for people who are bloggers coming across this, they'd say, yeah, but what is it that you're really trying to find out here? What is it that you're actually doing? The Buzzfeed person said, we don't know who people are, we don't know any of their POI, their personally identifiable information. They're saying, we can't tie this back to you. And certainly it's a concern for actually quite a lot of the readers online. We get sort of comments, we get emails. I had one earlier this week from someone saying, I don't like all the tracking you're doing of me on the web page, especially given that you're the guys who wrote all the stuff about the NSA and all the things that they find out about us. Why is it you want to know so much about me with all the tracking cookies and so on that you're setting? And some people say that we set 17 different tracking cookies. It's possible, though. I think those are possibly more down to advertisers. I think The Guardian itself, we only set one tracking cookie. And the way that I've suggested to people that you need to think about this is that we're not actually detecting people. We're doing something rather like this. We're saying, hey, you're a car. We don't know who's driving the car, but you're a car. Please come in. Here we are. These gates, this is the newspaper. This is the newspaper's website. You're a car, come in. And we'll show you all sorts of things. Once they come in, then we drop a cookie, and in effect, we're able to see the number plate. Still don't know who owns the car. So in that sense, what we're doing is to identify cars, but we don't know who the drivers are. And I think that that's actually an important point that people perhaps need to understand, which is difficult to get across because people who are on the other end of it, people who are using things like Ghostery and stuff, which tell you what's being tracked, people tend to go, whoa, I know that I'm here sitting looking at this web page and Ghostery is telling me that it's doing all these things. But the fact that there's this lack of joining up being done isn't self-evident, and it tends to get people concerned. Like I say, we're tracking the cars. So now what I want to go into is, what is it that we do at The Guardian? What sort of tracking of the cars do we do? How do we do it? What does it tell us? What does it not tell us? Where is it all going? I'm old enough that I know that I started in journalism at a time when actually we used typewriters. In fact, the first week or so, it was so early we hadn't really got the facts worked out. So we had to use carbon paper. No one remembers what carbon paper is. It was a way of actually producing a duplicate while you, by putting 2 sheets of paper. You put 1 sheet of paper, carbon paper, then you put another one, you use the typewriter key knocks through to the second one. And the carbon copies would be sent off to the printers so that the printers had a copy of what we had in the newspaper office. Because obviously the printers are not in the same place. We moved on to computers, but it wasn't on the web, and obviously the web sort of only really got started as a way to present your work in, late 90s, sort of 97, 8 or so. And things have moved on at a hell of a pace in the last 10 years especially. So what we do at The Guardian is when we're writing a story, when we're preparing a story, before it actually goes live, we do what is called tagging it. So the tags are all these things down here. This is a story from earlier this week from the Google I/O conference. And we say, well, what is this story about? What are the topics that this story covers? It's a technology topic, so that's the main one there. It's got Google, it's got Android, it's got smartphones because Android runs on smartphones, it's got tablets, it's about computing because Google is roughly about computing, it's got mobile phones, it's got software. I mean, possibly we could have added in wearables there, we could have added in TV, but there are sort of questions about, well, do you mean TV as a technology, or do you mean TV as something that people consume as that they watch, like sort of Game of Thrones or something? And so the question about quite how you tag stuff can get into quite complicated discussions. If you're being really complex, I suppose we could have also had San Francisco, because it happened in San Francisco. San Francisco is, as a tag, is part of a sort of a parent-child relationship, which would mean that it's part of California, which means it's part of the United States, which means it's part of the world. But if you sort of go into that sort of level, then it can all get very, very complicated very fast. Much simpler just to say, yeah, these are the main topics that this story is about. Here's another story, also from this week. Again, this is about Apple. It's about iPhones. So you have an iPhone tag, you have an Apple tag, you have an iOS tag, because it's all to do with will iOS 8 work on bigger phones, and if it does, how are you going to do that? Mobile phones and smartphones. If you go back between this and the previous story, you see there's some overlap. There's smartphones, there's mobile phones, and you could say that there are some areas where these two stories overlap. People who are interested in the one might be interested in the other, because they're sort of smartphones, mobile phones. You might sort of think about perhaps showing the other story to the people who read this one, and people who read the other story there, they might show them this one. So the tags are a measure of what people might be interested in. If someone never reads a technology story, if they never read a story that's got Apple in it, and even though they do spend a lot of time on the technology site, you get an idea of what their interests are. And we're quite meticulous about tagging. Sometimes we add tags after things have happened. Sometimes we add tags when we think a subject has become important. So wearable computing is a tag that we've had for about a year or so, actually, because I agitated and said that it was something that was going to become quite big in the future, and that we should really have a way of measuring people's interest in it, in effect, because that's what a tag does. When you create a tag, you say, we think this is a topic of interest, we think this is a topic we're going to be writing about, we think it's something people are going to be reading about, and therefore we need to be pulling together what we know about it. When you do that, then you start being able to build up using the cookie that you have on people's web browsers. You start to be able to profile the cars. You start to know who's coming to see you. And this is for someone you can just about make out in the top left, what's called an OFN-RD. OFN is our in-house stats package. It's a sort of real-time analytics package that we built ourselves. So you have a unique ID for the person there, various bits of detail around, various colors for tags which are in different places. I'll just expand this. So you have someone who seems to be, judging by what they look at, they're interested in Aston Villa, Manchester United, the Premier League obviously, don't seem to care about many other things. They're interested in food, they're a bit interested in world affairs. You've got France, Russia, Nigeria, race here. You might sort of draw inferences about them based on that. Housing, so possibly there's someone who's interested in the topic. With all those sorts of pieces of information, you could start to build up an idea of, well, what sort of things is this person interested in? What should we show them if they come along and we want to do related content? These are all sorts of things that the data scientists at The Guardian are always thinking about quite hard. It's quite a tricky thing to do, though, because we don't have just one person doing this, and we don't have just 4 people. These are 4 different OFAN IDs, which I picked up the other day. So looking at this person there that's Europe, news, Russia, Labour, UKIP, so this is someone who seems to be interested in politics, also health, so possibly NHS there. This person, that's the USA down there. Fiction, I think those books, other things. Russia, sex, USA, internet, games, health down there. They really arranged this really interesting. Cricket, US sport, Arsenal, USA, television, Chelsea. You sort of get an idea of 4 different people. Now, there's not just 4 people. The Guardian had more than 100 million browsers visit in a single month earlier this year, which is a new record for us. But 100 million browsers, that's 100 million cookies. It might not be 100 million people, given the fact that people might be reading in different locations. It might only be 25 million people. That's a lot of people, though, to keep track of. This is where the big data element of what we're doing at The Guardian really comes into play, is trying to say, OK, so you have these people with these interests. How do they map onto the people with those interests? What are the things that we should be doing? What are the stories that we could be serving to, the green bubble person over here who's interested in sport and the USA and TV and Chelsea and Arsenal, compared to the person over here who's interested in Russia, Labour, UKIP? How do you choose what sort of stories you're going to be doing for them? What sort of stories you write? What sort of stories? Because we've got 1 million stories in our archive. What sort of stories do you serve up to them to say, hey, this is something you read, you just read a story about that, now you might be interested in reading a story about this. Because for us, the longer we can get someone to stay on the site, obviously the more advertising we can show them. It's a pretty simple exchange. People give us their time, advertisers give us their money in exchange for the fact that they can show adverts to people over that time. It's a pretty simple transaction, and actually that's pretty much the way that newspapers have worked for years and years. The cover price of newspapers is mostly to do with the cost of print and distribution. When you don't have that, then you just move straight to the attention monetization model. So once you aggregate all those loads and loads and loads and loads of people, then you can build up the picture of everyone and everything. This is the top 1,000 keywords for 2013, between April of 2013 and June of 2014 by page view. And you have a very large one here, which is the USA. You have a fairly big one, but not that gigantic as you might expect. The NSA files, which is all to do with Snowden and surveillance. You have the NSA there, because these two are sort of connected, but they're slightly different. The NSA files and things the NSA does might not be exactly overlapping. Internet over here, that's quite a big one. Food and drink, that's a big player. Health up there, BBC over there, that's a media story generally. Women over here, UK crime, because you had all the hacking trials and so on. Gender, which seems to be a hot topic. Religion, Asia Pacific, Australia, because we set up an Australian site, which has been going very well. There's a huge variety of things that you can choose from. And the question is, how do you sort of arrange what you're going to write about? How do you deploy your resources in the best way? I don't know whether these sorts of things determine how we deploy our resources in terms of editorial budgets. I'm afraid that's slightly above my pay grade to know that. But you could see how people might think, well, hey, we got a lot of hits to do with the USA. Maybe we should actually have more resources put into that. Interesting, like I say, there's the USA, which is the big one there, the Europe news one. And this is for technology. So this is the top technology tags by page view. This is the same period from April 2013 through to June of this year. And if we just look at which ones they are, you get this sort of pattern. I've sort of tried to pick out the biggest ones. And you get sort of the usual suspects, generally. So, you know, the smartphones, the iPhones, the internet. The internet comes up a lot because a lot happens on it. Data protection is an interesting one because a lot of that's to do with hacking often. In terms of data protection is a big subject because it's about when something gets hacked, then that's about the protection of data. And there's been a lot of hacking stories recently, and people have been very interested by them. Google, Apple, Microsoft, you might sort of expect those as the usual suspects. It's interesting that the Google one is very slightly larger than the Apple one, but those are actually quite a bit bigger than the Microsoft one. Games is a big topic for us. That's bigger than Apple in aggregate, smaller than Google. Twitter is surprisingly big for us. Mobiles and smartphones, again, is a big topic for us. But you can sort of see that we have to sort of think our way around what is it that people are interested in. Because remember, you know, we're not making people come and read these stories. We're not sort of forcing them to go and read a data protection story. We're just saying, yeah, this story deals with data protection, and you might find it interesting. But we don't have any way of actually making people read the stories. We just sort of put them out there. And what people choose to read is very much determined by, you know, the interest of readers, and that's an interesting subject. But there are limits. There are limits to everything, and I'm often a skeptic about the potential for what data can and can't do. I tend to sort of say, yeah, you really have to prove these things to me. So, like I say here, can't tell you what's going to be the big topic tomorrow. Earlier this week, it looked like a fairly quiet Tuesday. And in fact, as I understand it, our data scientists can usually predict how big a day we're going to have on the website by 8 o'clock in the morning. They have an idea of how busy it's going to be. Turned out not to be true because on Tuesday, at about 11 o'clock, the verdicts came in from the first phone hacking trial, and that was one of our biggest days ever. So, you know, events, dear boy, events. These are the things that simply make trying to predict exactly what's going to happen impossible. You can't tell people. You can't tell what people are definitely going to want to read. You sort of have an idea that if you have an Apple conference or you have a Google conference, that there'll be some interest from people. But actually, if they're really boring, then they won't. About the only things that we can hang our hat on generally is that if Apple launches a product, then quite a lot of people will want to read about it. I don't know why that would be. It just seems to be the fact that people are more exercised, more interested in Apple products than others. Samsung products did go through a phase. They were sort of going up, but that seems to have leveled off. There's something about brand power to be said in that. And also old articles and new topics. Again, you can't sort of predict. One of the things when we used to have a printed edition of the technology supplement, the aim I had in it was that I wanted the stories in it to tell you what was going to be important 6 months from now, so that when those things came up in 6 months' time, you'd be briefed in effect. The difficulty is that things are changing at such a speed that it's become rather harder to pick those things out. And also, you're trying to sort of just keep the flywheel turning of all the stories that are happening. I mean, I generally say that on any given day, there are at least 12 stories that I could find interesting enough to write, subjects that are actually worth me spending some time writing. But on any given day, I also know that generally I'll only get about 3 of them written. So that means that I can only write a quarter of the things that I think are interesting on any given day. That makes it quite difficult to start picking out things that are going to be important for 6 months' time. But this thing about old articles and what people want to read is really weird. So this is a story which I wrote in August of 2012, which followed on from the first Apple-Samsung trial, where Apple was awarded $1 billion. There's actually damages. The fine line in that is actually wrong. I wrote it pretty quickly. I knocked it off in half an hour. It was a sort of a stupid, there was a stupid sort of humor story going around, and people were taking it seriously, thinking that Samsung had sent a whole lot of trucks filled with nickels to Apple's headquarters to pay the damages. It was obviously wrong on a number of levels if people had bothered to think about it, but they liked the story, so they passed it on. So I wrote this in August 2012. It got a fair amount of interest. A number of people read it. It turns out that rebutting stories that are wrong actually gets quite a lot of readership. Who knew? Now we go to 2013. There's the story. It came up again because Apple and Samsung had another trial, and it popped up again. So this was the number 2 story for the whole. This is for page views for the whole of 2013. Number 2 story. And also have a look at the number 3 story. Man buys $27 of Bitcoin, forgets about them, finds they're now worth $886,000. That's a hell of a story as well. That's the 3rd most read story. That was actually a current story from the year. People love those, get rich quick on Bitcoin stories. But who doesn't? And everyone loved the story about the guy who lost his hard drive in the Welsh tip. Oh my God. If you go back, though, and say, okay, so where do those things live? The Samsung and the nickels and the Bitcoin story, where do those live on this thing? Because those were really big stories. Those are the 2nd and 3rd biggest things for the whole of 2013. Looking at this, here's Samsung, here's Bitcoin. You go, huh? That's not very big. But surely those are really big stories. Yeah, but this is the thing about readers, newspapers, journalism, news. You can't predict what things are actually going to be gigantic and what are going to be the things that tick over, sort of like games. All the games reviews, all the stuff like that, and the constant sort of stream of Google and Apple stories that people just are interested in reading, and what things are going to be sort of they're a big spike hit and then they go away. Predicting spikes, I think, is sort of impossible. It's a bit like predicting a lightning strike in real life. You can sort of have an idea, that if you're standing under a tree in a thunderstorm, might not be the safest place, but you can't predict that it's definitely going to be the wrong place. Same with this. You can't say, oh yeah, out of these 5 stories, this one will definitely go gigantic. You can sort of develop an instinct about it, and that's the sort of thing that journalists do get after a while. They get a feel for what stories are going to be good. But you can't do it in any big way. So what all this stuff helps us to do, and we have a real-time tracker for what stories are going well, we can go for, we can say, if we're very time-constrained, which often we are, we can pick between 2 topics, but being exclusive, having a story which no one else has got, that tends to be something that draws people to the pages as well. And the approach, so the rebuttal type story that no, Samsung didn't do this, that sort of thing works well. I think that the way that Henry Blodgett has got Business Insider set up with the sort of headlines that pull people in, which possibly reaches its zenith or nadir, depending on your view, with Upworthy, with "you'll never believe what you're going to find when you click this headline." That sort of thing is interesting. But I'd actually point to the second to last point here. We can profile our readers, but the thing we can't do is profile the people who don't come to the site. Those are the ones who are the really hard people to understand. because there's a lot more of them than there are of the people who are on the site. And we also know that they exist. But they're sort of like dark matter. You know, what is the thing that we could do that would reach them? There's no way in the data that we have of being able to pull them out. We can sort of look for the people who are the first-time viewers and try to look at what they do. But there's so many waves of traffic of people coming in and then going away and coming in and going away, that trying to pick the people who come once and then go away, those are actually the ones who are the most valuable. And that's actually where the data scientists are spending the most amount of time, is trying to understand the people who come once, read one thing, then go away. Why is that? What is the thing that we need to do in order to be able to understand them better? Is there a way that we could present them with something else, you know, something else on the page, another story to read, perhaps an interactive, perhaps a gallery, perhaps something altogether different? Understanding that is actually the really big task, because the more readers we get, the more money we get from advertisers, and the longer we can do this sort of thing. But while we're constrained in that way by not knowing why people don't even come to the site once, then we have a problem. And that's actually where a lot of our effort goes. So thank you very much for your time. I'll be around after the break, but that's what I have to tell you so far. Thank you.